Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mad in America podcast. I'm your host, Micah Engel, joined today by Dr. Daniel Gaztambide. Dr. Gaztambide is a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at Queens College. His clinical and academic work focuses on how, in his words, forces like patriarchy, capitalism, and racism trickle down into the everyday experience and well-being of individuals and communities. Dr. Gaztambide has published 2 books, the first called A People's History of Psychoanalysis, From Freud to Liberation Psychology, and just this year, a second book called Decolonizing Psychoanalytic Technique, Putting Freud on Fanon's Couch. Throughout Daniel's work, there is an emphasis on cultural humility and the suffering of those who are marginalized along axes of race, class, gender, ability, and more. In his most recent book, he offers both therapeutic clinical techniques and political strategy for addressing these issues. Daniel, thank you for speaking with me today. To start off, please introduce yourself. Who are you, and how did you arrive at the kinds of liberation-oriented psychologies that you advocate?
Sure. So again, my name is Daniel Jose Gaztambide. I'm originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and then later came for college here in the U.S. mainland, later in adulthood. But I guess where it all started, to be a little tongue-in-cheek, it goes back to childhood, goes back to my mother, as it were. And the reason I say that is because my mom was the secretary of our church growing up. And it just so happened that the pastors of our church were either in doctoral school for clinical psychology or were trained in different forms of psychodynamic pastoral counseling. And so it just kind of made sense in the kind of exposure that I had that psychology, psychoanalytic thinking, and the community were all very much interlinked with one another. So I always just had a sensibility to the idea that psychology is something that's experienced in community and in relationship with others. When I came stateside, though, obviously, that's not necessarily what everyone has in mind when they think about psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory. And I remember starting an undergrad and a little bit of my master's program, there just being like a bifurcation between thinking on the one hand about issues of social justice, about being in community, or on the other hand, that being kind of split off from psychoanalysis as a theory of the individual separate from its context. And I remember very clearly as I was kind of pondering these debates, there being a lecturer coming to a class that I took at Union Theological Seminary on developmental theory. And I was Claude Barber, actually, who was I think at the time at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. And he delivered a lecture, a very fascinating lecture that enthralled me on the work of Ignacio Martín Baró and liberation psychology. That was probably the first time that I even heard of such a thing, or that there was even a language for this kind of work. So it was after that I really dug deep into learning about Ignacio Martín Baró, about liberation psychology, of course, the work of Paulo Freire, the founder of critical pedagogy, pedagogy of the oppressed, all of which ultimately led me to the work of Franz Omar Fanon, who in many respects is the kind of prototypical ancestor of both liberation and decolonial psychology. So in other words, this is something that I kind of always felt in my upbringing, but only later came to have a language for really thinking about how psyche and society fit within one another in a very textured way.
Thank you. So I've been reading your most recent book, and I wanted to ask you kind of what motivated you to put these pieces together to write this book for therapists. I personally found your review of several psychoanalytic case studies and a lot of other information in the book extremely clear and insightful. So I'd love to hear more about what went into that.
When I think back to my original clinical training, when I went to Rutgers University at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology, I experienced something that I think many people experience in graduate school, certainly is the case today, where you're exposed to some kind of basic theory or basic model of psychotherapy, whether that's the basics of psychoanalytic therapy or humanistic experiential psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, family systems therapy, emotional focus therapy. And you learn the basics of those models, and then maybe 2 or 3 years in, you're exposed to something else, typically in the form of a single course called cultural competence or diversity. And I noticed that not only in my own work, but I also noticed that in many of my colleagues who write and think about social justice and psychotherapy, that even though they could articulate, all the ethical and moral reasons for why we should address issues of identity in psychotherapy, when it came to the actual mechanics, like what are the actual techniques? How does that tie back to a model of the mind or mental health? We would all kind of struggle to articulate what that was. In effect, the original book project that I was trying to work on was supposed to be a kind of treatment guide for working with complex trauma and personality disorder among working class communities of color. And I just realized as I tried to write that book that I really needed to kind of go back to basics, go back to zero, as it were, and start to theorize from the very foundations of what psychotherapy is, but in a way that introduced and kind of infused issues of social justice within the basic theory and technique in order to produce something much more integrated. So part of my hope with this book, the second offering, is to provide both beginning clinicians as well as seasoned practitioners with a language for how issues of social justice are intrinsic to psychotherapeutic technique, irregardless of the specific identities of the therapist or the specific identities of the patient. The reason I say that is because going back to this bifurcation, it's very easy to fall into the trap that you only think about the social when you're working with somebody that's perceived as being different, right? So you only think about social context when you're working with people of color or women or people who are poor or LGBT. But somehow, as if by magic, there is no social context if you're working with a white patient or a patient who's middle class, et cetera. So how do you bridge those different discourses of what causes suffering in a way that is integrated? So neither just thinking about early child development, nor just thinking about social and cultural context, but thinking about both in a way that makes theoretical and pragmatic sense.
Can you explain how you understand psychoanalysis and also decolonization? You use a metaphor in the book of broken circuits to describe the relationship between psychoanalysis and decolonization that I thought was really interesting.
So if we look at the whole of psychoanalytic history, and I certainly discuss a lot of this in my first book, we find that the beginning early psychoanalysts developed very rich and very fascinating theories of how to think about race and culture, how to think about gender and sexuality, and how to understand the ways in which social forces take root within the individual mind. So for example, Sandor Ferenczi, who's a kind of forerunner of interpersonal, humanistic, and relational psychotherapies, once wrote to Freud about how in psychoanalysis, we discover the real conditions of society as they are mirrored in the individual, cleansed of all hypocrisy and pretense. So in other words, there's this kind of awareness that what psychoanalysis is not just a clinical technique, but also a way of understanding society. The problem here is that that social critical theory was completely divorced from the clinical practice. So Freud might write in The Future of an Illusion that it would seem that society is the product of a small group of people who have control over the means of production and wealth distribution, but who then use religion and race to divide the populace in order to maintain their power. And in no way tie that in any of his clinical papers to clinical techniques. So again, in the origins of psychoanalytic, psychotherapeutic thought, the social was very much bifurcated from the clinical. It creates what I call a series of broken circuits in how we think about the human mind and how we think about society. So in that respect, a big part of this work is to try to connect the circuits between the theory of mind, the clinical technique, and the social critical theory. Part of how I do that with psychoanalysis is by focusing on three core theorists. So, of course, Freud, Ferenczi as a forerunner of humanistic, but also interpersonal and relational psychoanalysis, and of course, the work of Jacques Lacan, with Lacanian psychoanalysis being one of the most proliferated psychoanalytic theories used and practiced worldwide. And I look through each of them and I start connecting their theory of subjectivity, their theory of mind, with their model of clinical technique and very interesting insights that they had about race, class, culture, and identity. Now, from the other end of this discussion, I also focus a lot on the work of Frantz Fanon, who many people recognize as, one of the founders, again, of decolonial and liberation psychologies, but often read more as a theorist of revolution without considering the fact that day in and day out, he was a practicing psychoanalytic therapist, okay? Somebody who was seeing patients on the couch, sometimes 5 to 6 days a week, using a very interesting synthesis of Freudian ideas along with relational Ferenczian ideas, and of course, Lacan. But again, here with Fanon, we almost have the opposite problem. We focus so much on his political theories in such a way that it bifurcates it from his theory of mind and his model of clinical practice. So I'm essentially working my way from the inside of the psychoanalytic canon to the outside of the psychoanalytic canon through Fanon, almost like a Mobius strip, where the inside becomes outside and inside again, in order to essentially redo the psychoanalytic canon and redo the foundations of our field. Part of what the book offers is not just an account of what a decolonial psychoanalytic technique might be, but it also offers a decolonial explanation for why this bifurcation exists to begin with. And part of my answer to that question is that even though Freud in public very much wanted to be seen as a kind of erudite, white Enlightenment scientist, in private, he was very much concerned and very conscious of the fact that he was a Jewish man in an anti-Semitic racist world. And that in that world, even though he had these social democratic values, and even though the way that he practiced was much more flexible and much more, dare I say, relational than his public writings would show, he essentially hid those parts of himself in his public writing. And so part of what the book does is to excavate those aspects of Freud's clinical work that were actually surprisingly attuned to culture and race, surprisingly attuned to gender and sexuality with his patients, based on first-person accounts by the patients themselves of Freud's work. So we not only have to decolonize the canon, we also have to decolonize how we understand these thinkers themselves in a way that gives us today a lot more freedom for how we can practice with our patients, both on the couch, as well as thinking about what our political action and ethics might be off the couch and in the streets.
I get from reading the book that you definitely respect his work and find it sort of wanting in some ways. So I'm curious if you could address these two issues. Sort of what did Freud get right, and then what did he not get right?
Part of what was really surprising to me in writing this book was precisely being able to see all the things that Freud said that were incredibly prescient, and certainly from the point of view of contemporary science and contemporary psychological research, as well as appreciating, I think in a deeper way, precisely some of the great blind spots that he had. So if I were to start from the positive first, I would start with the theory of mind that he articulated. So to the extent we understand Freud as having described the human mind as being not just unconscious, but an unconscious that is textured by associations, connections, links between different experiences, and that those associations are organized around two things. On the one hand, our need and desire to find connection, to relate to others, to find intimacy and closeness, while at the same time also organized around our desire to find what is our position in the community, what is our status, how do we have a sense of power and positionality in the world, and that both of those things organize our behavior, our desires, our motivations, then I dare say there's a lot there that he got quite right. Now, at the same time, he also articulated, I think, a very interesting model of psychotherapy that in many respects also stood the test of time. So the idea that you have to build a therapeutic relationship with your patient, that you have to understand where it is that they're coming from, and to try to essentially walk a fine line between joining them where they are and at other times challenging them to go beyond where they are in the direction and interest of change is a fundamental tension that I think all psychotherapists can relate to. He also articulated a very interesting theory of how we understand different kinds of identities and positionalities and how that ties back to his model of the mind. And of course, that's part of what I reconstruct in the book, that different social forces such as racism, classism, sexism, etc., part of what they do is that even though they cause us different types of harm, and harm depending, of course, on our own individual identities and who we are, that they both cause different types of harm, but also provide different kinds of psychological compensations for that harm. And that it's out of this kind of compromise formation that we develop attachments to systems that, even though they harm us, also offer different kinds of privileges and pleasures that maintain our attachment to them. And of course, I go in the book into more detail as to what that looks like. To my eyes, these are very foundational and very important components to any kind of decolonial psychoanalytic project, and certainly a clinical one. And there's a lot there that I talk about in terms of the research that supports these ideas. So the first thing we have to understand is that many of the things that Freud dissociates from his theories, including the way he dissociates a social context, is itself an example of his own compromise formation, of the ways he enacted his attempt to survive the society of his time, while also trying to find his place within it, including trying to pursue his own privileges within that society for his own ends and goals, essentially to be seen as an erudite white scientist of the establishment. So some specific examples of this include some ways that he participated in a kind of colonial racist anthropology. We could also talk about some of the ways, to give a separate example, of how the original 1905 edition of his 3 essays of sexuality were in many ways incredibly revolutionary in the ways that he questioned, you know what, I don't think we need to answer and question how we understand homosexuality. Homosexuality is part and parcel of human beings and many biological organisms in nature. What we actually need to explain is heterosexuality, okay? That for the time is a very revolutionary statement, but it's a statement he starts to walk back, given that every 5 years since the publication of that revolutionary paper, he starts to edit the paper to make it fall in line with more conventional accounts. And he started to then kind of edit them out of his own record in order to better fit himself into the white patriarchal scientific establishment of the time. And I think we need to be able to hold both of those things in mind, both the things that are useful in Freud's work and the things we need to resoundingly critique in order to create a more inclusive and open psychoanalysis for the future.
You also offer a critique of relational and interpersonal approaches that may also apply to humanistic psychotherapy. What is it that broadly defined relational approaches might offer a decolonial approach? And also, what limitations do they have when it comes to sociocultural issues?
Let me start first, again, with the positives and use that to kind of spring forward into some of the limitations of this kind of thinking. So I trace many of the kind of foundational ideas of different relational and interpersonal approaches in ways relevant, I think, as you're alluding to humanistic psychotherapy as well, to the work of one Sándor Ferenczi, somebody that many people precisely in these three traditions have kind of come back to as a progenitor of interpersonal and humanistic thinking in psychoanalysis and beyond. Essentially, one of his major contributions was the idea that psychotherapy is not just an encounter in which the therapist does something to the patient in order to create change, but that rather the psychotherapeutic process in some ways demands that both parties change. that there's something about the therapist that needs to be reflected on as they're engaging with the patient that could either impede the process or be the very vehicle for the change to occur. So to put it simply, it's not just that the patient examines themselves and works towards change. It's also that the therapist, as a kind of collaborator in that process, they need to look at themselves too. Part of Ferenczie's insights is that if the therapist can reflect on how they're contributing to that impasse and to acknowledge openly the things that they might be doing in relation to the patient, that this can create an aperture for the two of them to examine that rupture together and use it to move towards a repair. So not only can there be tensions in the therapeutic relationship due to, say, unreflected attachment schemas on part of both patient and therapist, but that there can also be ruptures and impasses due to difference in terms of race, gender, sexuality, or class, and often applying very similar techniques. So again, if the therapist can remain open and reflect on their own positionality, maybe reflect on the ways in which their own biases are getting enacted in relation to the patient, this can again create a space where they can reflect not only on how race, class, and culture, gender, and sexuality are being enacted in the relationship, but can use that as a kind of springboard to talk about how the social context is impacting both the patient and the therapist and the therapeutic relationship. Where do we get into trouble, though? Now I have to switch over to the not so nice things I have to say about relational interpersonal theory. In the same way that Ferenczi was incredibly brilliant in how he thought about the therapeutic relationship, there are some ways in which that very lens narrowed his ability to look at the social cultural world. And there are many papers that he wrote early in his career tracing, for example, how issues of class and race can trickle down into the intimacy of our relationships. However, later in his career, and specifically with the rise of the Nazis and fascism across Europe, Ferenczi kind of retreated from the world of the social. I think to an extent, understandably. So Ferenczi, he was also a Jewish man. You got to think about, he's sort of seen the rise of fascism across Europe. And he's writing to a lot of his friends about how deeply terrified he is. So in some respects, he too, like Freud, is withdrawing and dissociating the social context in his theories as a way of protecting himself, but also maintaining certain kinds of privilege in the world as somebody who can be read as white. What happens when he starts to narrow the scope of what psychoanalysis can do to two people in the room? Does the therapist bring up race, gender, sexuality, and class? Or do you wait for the patient to bring up issues of race, gender, sexuality, and class? The very structure of that question, because it's so inherently interpersonal, does not allow room for other ways of thinking about how the social context is always already there. It's precisely this consideration that then turns me from this appraisal of relational and interpersonal theories to bringing in not only Jacques Lacan's ideas, but the way that Lacan's ideas are used by Frantz Fanon. In sum, the idea that it's never just two people in the consulting room, that in the therapeutic relationship, there's always an embeddedness within its broader socio-political world, what Lacan and later Fanon referred to as a third term, such that always already between the two of us, or between two of us or more, there's always a broader collective context. And it's only if we can theorize from that perspective that we're never just two people alone in this room, that we can create some space for thinking about the social in a way that is deeply organic, that emerges in a way that's relevant to the presenting problem of the patient, and which essentially decenters the question of who brings it up.
What does Fanon have to say to Freud and maybe sort of these other psychoanalysts that we're talking about here? And, and also just to the practice of psychoanalysis and psychology more generally today.
For sure. So I guess for background, something that's very interesting about Frantz Fanon. So for folks who may not be as familiar, so he was an Afro-Caribbean man originally from the island of Martinique, which at the time was essentially an unincorporated territory or colony of France. And in the outbreak of the Second World War, he initially had this kind of very idyllic kind of idealization of not only being a part of France as a nation, but the idea that, we're all part of this struggle together, right? We're all part of this universal humanity. A strike against one is a strike against all. And he sort of uses that as inspiration to, join on the side of the Allies to fight the Nazis and expel them from France. But in very short order, after the Nazis are expelled, instead of being welcomed as a hero in France, he, like many other Black men at the time from France's colonies, are essentially treated as second-class citizens and lesser than human. And that leads him to truly reflect on, well, what does it mean to grow up in a colony? What does it mean to be positioned as lesser than and outside the category of what it means to be a human being? And that very much inspires him to pursue a career in psychiatry. And through his studies, he winds up being under the supervision of the Catalan psychiatrist François de Tosquelles, himself an anti-fascist who was on the side of the left back during the Spanish Civil War, and who himself was trained, supervised, and in analysis with different people from different traditions. So he as much was very informed by Lacanian psychoanalysis as he was also by kind of Ferencian relational ideas. And he very much exposed Fanon to this very interesting synthesis between, on the one hand, relational and Lacanian ideas and different strands of Marxist thinking. Now, Fanon is not only informed by those ideas theoretically, but is also informed by some of the ways that the Tosquelles applied those ideas clinically within the context of the inpatient unit. So in many ways, the Tosquelles, but also Fanon, expanded the relational notion of two people in a room working in an interactive, interpersonal way. And they broadened it to say, hey, it's not just the therapist and the patient in the inpatient unit. It's the therapist, the patient in the inpatient unit. So the institution itself plays a role in the therapeutic process. That Tosquelles wrote very candidly, there's a way in which mental illness reflects a kind of occupation of the mind, the ways in which social structures and social forces occupy the psyche and lead to, psychopathology to not just be something within the individual and not just between the individual and interpersonal others, but also to reflect a kind of societal collapse, a societal fracture or rupture in the social contract. So if mental illness reflects a kind of occupation of the mind, then psychological liberation must involve a process of disoccupation. And Fanon was very much informed by these ideas in his own clinical work later on when he was essentially kind of chief attending in Algeria and later Tunis. And although he believed that it was very important for the clinician to be able to reflect on themselves and their own biases, he also felt that it was too narrow of a way of conceptualizing the problem. It's not simply, for example, oh, the patient is bad, they're borderline, or they have too much trauma, or they're not analyzable. But it's also not enough to say that there's a problem in the therapist has prejudice, or the therapist has unresolved trauma. Rather, the question he asked was, how does the institution, how does the broader system, how does the broader context support the therapeutic relationship in being able to do its work? And to that end, he engaged in a number of both systematic reforms as well as ongoing supervision and consultation to the nursing staff, to the clinicians, to the other psychiatrists on the unit to be able to support them in doing the psychotherapeutic work. So again, he's underscoring the role of what he calls the social or systemic third. That it's not just a patient, it's not just the therapist in relation to the patient, it's also how that surrounding context supports the therapeutic relationship in order to be a tool for what he called disalienation, to be an experience, an encounter between two freedoms, between two subjects who are able to engage in a novel experience with each other. Now, this, of course, applies as much in the context of one-to-one psychotherapy as it does the context of institutional, but also broader policy reform. In some respects, If in psychoanalysis, you have a debate between a one-person psychology, everything is within the individual mind, and a two-person psychology, things happen between two people. In some respects, Fanon advocates for a kind of no-person psychology. We're not reducible to our relationships and we're not reducible to our individual minds. We are much more open and dynamic systems than we often recognize within the field of psychology. And I go into a lot of detail as to what that means, as well as citing a lot of research that supports this conceptualization of the mind and what the implication might look like in the context of face-to-face interpersonal psychotherapy.
You say that, for a decolonial psychoanalysis, there would be two foundations. There would be the primacy of the therapeutic relationship and then the fundamental rule of free association. So could you expand on these in the context of therapeutic practice?
For sure. So as a form of, background to our conversation, often when we're engaging in clinical work, right, we have some underlying theory of what we think causes the presenting problem. For the most part, many of these theories, as I alluded to earlier, are inherently dyadic in nature. So they're focusing on the individual in relation to their interpersonal relationships. So if that's the way we listen to our patients, then it stands to reason that we would be listening for certain kinds of material centered around interpersonal relationships, and sometimes struggle a little bit for how to listen to other kinds of material that may not be inherently about interpersonal relationships. It may involve them, it may implicate them, but may also include, again, the broader social, political, and cultural context. So what I've essentially attempted to do through this book is to articulate a theory of mind that gives us a broader conceptualization of what kinds of issues people wind up coming to therapy about. As I mentioned earlier, on the one hand, the need for closeness, connection, and intimacy, particularly in our interpersonal relationships. I call that the language of horizontality. So how do we approach or create distance from other people in our interpersonal world? But we're also organized around what is our place in the community? What do we find is our position within different types of hierarchies? What's our place in the world? How do we find value? So not just do we feel loved by other people, but do we feel that we're engaging in meaningful work? Do we feel that we're recognized in our broader communities as having value? This I refer to as a language of verticality, above and below. Am I somebody who is, high up in the hierarchy, feels a sense of value, a sense of status? Am I somehow pushed all the way down to the bottom? Or am I anxiously sort of stuck in the middle, trying to make sure I don't fall to the bottom, but anxiously trying to find my way to the top? So think of something very simple that you might hear from patients in day-to-day work. Somebody who says, for example, Doc, I don't know, I feel like I'm not where I should be. Just hearing that very simple phrase, I'm not where I should be, can be heard in a number of different ways, right? You could hear it certainly through the lens of attachment, what kind of attachment dynamic might be played out and how the patient is speaking. But another way to hear that statement, I'm not where I should be, is to hear the kind of spatiality of the statement, which implies that the patient is in some position, perhaps a lower position, that they feel they should not be. They should actually be in some higher position. And sometimes through the act of reflecting back those words and inviting the patient to elaborate, you can very quickly start digging into different dimensions of identity that are implicated in that verticality. So what I'm essentially saying is that when you're building a therapeutic relationship and you're trying to hear your clients, what it is you attune to makes a difference in how they speak and what they say. And so being able to build a therapeutic relationship where you're attending to multiple frequencies of the patient's experience, absolutely. And of course, the relational dimension, which is what many of us are trained to listen to, but also attuning to those dimensions of the patient's experience that are collective, that are organized around status and hierarchy, can also give us a lease to be able to talk about many of those issues quite organically and in ways that are tied to the presenting problem. This connects in turn very organically to what we call in psychoanalytic therapy, the fundamental rule of free association. Now, in the book, I talk about how you could certainly offer the patient the invitation to say everything that comes to mind without censoring yourself, to try to be as free and open as you can. And part of my job will be to listen very closely and to try to help you talk through the different problems you're bringing up. But I also argue that more often than not, that's not something we need to tell the patient to do. That's something that the patient's mind and our mind is always doing at all times, always associating, always making connections. The reason I bring that up in the book as a central technique of a decolonial psychoanalytic approach is that if we're listening, again, on these multiple frequencies, we create opportunities for the patient to sometimes almost absent-mindedly, without necessarily being aware of it, telling us a lot, not just about their relationships, but how they see themselves in their community and how their community sees them. It gets us talking without needing to raise the question of, do I bring it up or does the patient bring it up? We can just start talking very organically about the kind of problems patients have and how those problems are nested in a broader world. Essentially, I'm suggesting that when you understand the human mind as inherently textured by the social, you don't need to get into these kind of anxious deliberations of whether you talk about race, you don't talk about race. You talk about gender, you don't talk about gender. You talk about class, you don't talk about class. We all exist in this world, and race, class, gender, and sexuality textures all of our experience, irregardless of our specific identities and positionalities. However, if we can create a stance of openness precisely towards those topics, we can use different techniques and tools to invite them into the room in ways that I think are resoundingly psychoanalytic.
Thank you. So zooming out a little bit from clinical practice, I was thrilled to see a section toward the end of your book on the limitations of psychotherapy, at least on its own, where you talk about the importance of political action, fighting the injustices of racism, capitalism, patriarchy, and other forms of social injustice. Could you say more about this? Do you see a role for psychotherapy in relation to these broader political struggles?
For sure. So let me answer that question in the way of a metaphor. A metaphor that I offer in the book as well. I mean, if I were a cardiologist and I have access to the best available tools to be able to treat patients who have heart problems, to essentially fix broken hearts. And then I noticed after a while working in, say, a mixed income community, neighborhood clinic, or working in a hospital with a very diverse population, I noticed, gee, there sure is a lot of folks showing up to my consulting room with broken hearts. At a certain point, I might get curious about what is it that's going on in the world that's leading to so much heart disease, that's leading to so many heart problems. And I may simultaneously continue doing my work, doing the best work that I can as a cardiologist, while also asking questions about what policies, what kinds of structures, what kinds of social context and politics are leading to people, for example, not having access to good, healthy foods, or being so stressed out that they're not able to get good sleep, or being in conditions where their stress response is so out of whack that they continue to have all sorts of heart conditions and heart diseases. To essentially think about the connection between the patients who are right in front of me and these broader social problems that are taking place in the world. I borrow here a phrase that I always found very interesting from dialectical behavior therapy, which is this idea of helping the patient build a life worth living, which I think is all fine and dandy, for sure. Let's totally help our patients live healthier, more fulfilling lives. Let's also wonder how we can build a world that's worth living in. And to that end, I start to tie some of the more clinical formulations in the book to a more broader political formulation about what it is that ails us. So I state this at the beginning of the book in the introduction, and I come back and I revisit it in the conclusion. The basic formulation of the book is grounded in what Fanon called sociogeny. Sociogeny involves the understanding that human psychology takes place in a context, and it takes place in a context that is indelibly textured by what we might call political economy. So the ways in which resources are distributed in society along axes of race, class, gender, and sexuality. To make a long story short, we live in what we call a racial capitalist society. So it's a capitalist system that is punctured by incredible income inequality. And that income inequality is itself subtended by different forms of racist discourse and racialized oppression. There's a lot of thinking and research going back to the Black radical tradition, certainly the origins of decolonial psychoanalysis in turn, that suggests very strongly that one of the ways in which the system is maintained is through the use of racism, and we could also add sexism and queerphobia as tools of divide and conquer that maintain the power of the wealthiest in our society. And that the wealthiest in our society exploit these discourses in order to divide the populace and prevent any kind of meaningful change in society, such that even though in many ways you might be suffering because of the inequalities that we navigate within our world, this society also offers, as I mentioned earlier, different kinds of compensations to maintain your attachment to the way that things are. To give a very quotidian example, there's a lot of research that shows that many liberal-minded people, often white, but not exclusively white, very liberally minded people, notice that their politics change and often become much more conservative when they experience either racial or economic threat. In other words, the sense that there's some other who is going to threaten my lifestyle, my way of living. And when that happens, people often become much more conservative, much more right-wing, both socially as well as economically, in ways that ultimately wind up maintaining the way that the systems work. So what I suggest in the book is that given the ways in which the system operates to create division and how that division maintains the political economy of the system, we need, number one, to think about political strategies that help us address that division in order to build multiracial class solidarity, but also to think about what policies and what procedures, what kinds of interventions will dismantle the power of economic elites in order to create a society, again, as Freud, I think, very fascinatingly said in The Future of an Illusion, to create a society in which civilization is oppressive to no one, and where we can all, I'm paraphrasing here, and where we can all avail ourselves of the fruits of our work. Essentially a society that leaves no one to be consigned to the bottom, and where we can all find our place to be in community with each other. One very fascinating implication of a lot of the research that I did is the ways in which the clinical ethics of this model translate in a very fascinating, very lovely way to the political ethics of this model. Here, I cite as an example research on something called deep canvassing. Now, to make a very long story short, part of what this model shows is that human subjectivity, human psychology is incredibly diverse. People are of more than one mind, and people often have both very conservative and very progressive views, often existing within the same person. However, when you have these right-wing, fear-based messages in play, it often tends to flip people in the direction of more conservative views. What deep canvassing suggests is that being able to entertain an open dialogue where you're not trying to change the other person's mind, but you're actually trying to understand what are the fears that motivate their beliefs. That creates a space where both you and the other person can actually reflect on what's really going on and create an opportunity for those beliefs to change. And I cite a very lovely example from this literature where a queer activist who was doing some canvassing against laws that are anti-LGBT, and she knocks on the door of an older Latino gentleman. And when you see the video, it's very fascinating because at first it seems that this is going to go off the rails very quickly, because this older Latino gentleman is obviously very anti-LGBT. He has a lot of different fears and anxieties and phobias around trans people. But the activist is able to engage him in a way that creates this kind of open, empathic dialogue that ultimately leads them to reflect on his own biases, but also for the two of them to connect on some shared values. Essentially, this older gentleman is taking care of his wife who's struggling with a disability. And the activist suggests to him, well, gee, the reason that I'm out here advocating for a stronger social safety net, the reason why I'm advocating for stronger rights is because of my partner who's trans. And it seems like we both ultimately are trying to build a world where we're able to take care of each other and take care of our loved ones. And it's at that point where the older gentleman pipes up in response, yeah, because what affects them affects you too. So essentially, they're able to have a different kind of dialogue than what we often see, say, on social media, dare I say, where we're able to use a lot of these different tools and techniques to move the conversation in the direction of social change in a way that moves us out of a zero-sum frame that can often get us stuck in conversations that don't necessarily lead toward progress and change. In many respects, these kind of ideas, I've often felt they can be a little anxiety provoking, given that we live in such a polarized world. But I've deeply, truly come to believe, drawing on, all the body of work that are reviewed in the book, that we need to think of new ways of having dialogue, both in psychotherapy, as well as new ways to having dialogue in the world of politics, in order to create precisely the kind of solidarity we need to create true and substantive change.
Thank you. So your first book was on the relationship between psychoanalysis and liberation theology, liberation psychology. Your most recent is promoting this decolonial psychoanalysis that you've been talking about. What's next for you? What's on the horizon?
As I mentioned earlier, a lot of developmental theory tends to be inherently dyadic in nature in ways that exclude any consideration of the social cultural context, let alone ways of thinking about attachment and child rearing outside of just a twosome of parent and child. So the next leg of my work right now is going to be to imagine, well, gee, what would it mean to decolonize developmental theory? What would it mean to create a theory of development that, certainly has an appreciation for attachment theory, but also includes other types of research drawn from anthropology, cross-cultural psychology, research on attachment in other cultures, in order to build a different developmental theory that can thus inform clinical practice. Now, because we're talking about psychoanalysis after all, that also means revisiting psychoanalytic theories of gender and sexuality. There's been a lot of recent work coming out, certainly from the work of Avi Sakatepolu, but also Anne Pellegrini, that very much engage different decolonial theories to rethink how we understand gender and sexuality. And part of what I hope to do is to bring their work together along with some very recent developments in decolonial feminism and other kind of critical theories using psychoanalytic thought to essentially think through, well, what would be a theory of gender and sexuality for 2024 that can have some new implications for clinical practice? Because again, for me, all of this has to feed back into how we do our work and how we can do our work, in a more inclusive and better way. What would it mean when working, whether with LGBT couples or working with cis heterosexual couples? What would it mean to consider that not only is there a perhaps problematic pattern of relating that's come up in the relationship, but that those patterns of relating in turn take place against this broader social context that can turn people in their intimate relationships against one another.
Dr. Gaztambide, thank you for speaking with me. Thank you for the clarity of your work around these important issues.
Thank you so much, Micah. Happy to be here.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.